And the winner is Peter Falk, Columbo.
There is a filing cabinet somewhere in the vaults of Universal Studios that, according to people who worked there in the 1970s, once held a script nobody was allowed to shoot. Not because it was badly written. Not because nobody wanted it. It was buried because the man who wrote it saw something in a rumpled TV detective that network executives were not ready to let America see. For half a century, the story of that script has floated around as rumor, half remembered by old crew members and mentioned only in passing by film historians. Today we're going to pull that story out of the drawer. To understand why this episode was too much for network television in 1973, you first have to understand what Columbo actually was, because it wasn't really a detective show. It was a magic trick disguised as one. In the early 1960s, two young writers named Richard Levinson and William Link were grinding out scripts for hire, the kind of anonymous television work that paid rent but built no reputation. They were fans of mystery fiction, particularly the kind where the reader already knows the answer and the pleasure comes from watching someone else figure it out. That structure has a name in crime fiction circles, the inverted mystery, sometimes called a how-catch-em instead of a whodunit. Levinson and Link were drawn to the format, and they built a character around it. He would not chase criminals through alleys. He would not pull a gun. He would simply outthink people who believed they were too smart, too rich, or too important to ever get caught. That character first appeared not on television but on a live broadcast anthology series, played by an actor who has mostly been forgotten by history. He was serviceable, quietly watchful, but the part didn't have a face yet. It got one when the character migrated to the stage in a play about a psychiatrist who murders his wife, and then again a few years later when NBC turned that same story into a television movie. It was at that point, casting a made-for-TV mystery in the late 1960s, that the show found its Columbo. Character actor Peter Falk, a man missing an eye since childhood, a detail he rarely mentioned and never let slow him down, took the role after bigger names passed on it. What he brought to the part wasn't in the script. It was a way of talking, a way of standing in a doorway just a beat too long, a habit of seeming to apologize for existing while quietly taking apart a suspect's alibi. Falk didn't just perform the character. He built him, piece by piece, out of his own instincts. He is the one who decided that Columbo should look poor next to the wealthy killers he pursued, the wrinkled raincoat, the beat-up sedan, the cheap cigar. None of that was handed to him by a costume department. It came from Falk himself, who reportedly picked out much of his own wardrobe and insisted on driving an unglamorous car because he thought it told the audience something true about who this man was. A detective who looked like nothing, going after people who thought they were untouchable, that contrast became the entire emotional engine of the show. By the early 1970s, Columbo had become one of the biggest hits on American television, airing as part of NBC's rotating mystery movie umbrella alongside other detective franchises. Falk had already picked up an Emmy for the role and would collect several more before the decade was out. The format was, by then, a known quantity: show the murder up front, follow the killer as they build what they believe is a flawless cover story, then bring in the detective and watch, slowly, as tiny inconsistencies unravel a plan the audience already knows is doomed. Writers who worked on the show later described it as one of the hardest jobs in television, because you couldn't rely on a twist ending. Tension had to come from character, from the small, human mistakes rich and powerful people make when they think no one is paying attention. That reputation, sharp writing, a beloved star, strong ratings, is exactly why one particular pitch in the summer of 1973 caused such a stir behind the scenes. The story goes that a young filmmaker, already known in Hollywood for a stylish, unsettling thriller he'd just released, became fascinated with Columbo almost against his own instincts. He had built a reputation as a serious, cinema-obsessed director with little patience for the conventions of network television, but something about the show's premise, a killer who thinks he's smarter than everyone, undone by a shabby little man with an eye for detail, pulled him in. Rather than simply admire the show from a distance, he decided to write for it, teaming up with a friend who worked as a film critic to draft a spec script. According to accounts from people close to the production, the two men submitted their pitch almost anonymously, using a pseudonym rather than trading on the director's growing name. What made the pitch different from almost everything else Columbo had produced up to that point was the killer's motive, or rather, his lack of one. In the standard Columbo formula, the murderer always had something recognizable driving them: greed, jealousy, the fear of being exposed, the desire to protect a career or a fortune. The audience could understand these people even while despising them. The pitch from the summer of 1973 threw that convention out entirely. Its killer was a filmmaker, a stand-in for the kind of celebrity-obsessed, media-manipulating figure that was becoming a fixture of early 1970s culture, someone who murders a talk show personality not for money or revenge, but as an experiment. He wants to prove that a crime with no discernible motive is the only truly perfect crime, one that no detective, however clever, could ever fully explain. He treats the killing itself as a kind of performance art, going so far as to secretly document the aftermath, weaving Columbo's own investigation into his footage without the detective's knowledge. It was, in other words, a story about a man who kills purely to make a statement, and it turned the entire back half of the episode into something closer to a psychological hall of mirrors than a traditional mystery. Cameras within cameras. A killer performing innocence for footage he intends to use later. A detective slowly realizing that he himself has become raw material for someone else's twisted art project. Reading about the pitch decades later, it's easy to see why the producers were both impressed and terrified. Impressed because it was undeniably clever, layered, and unlike anything the series had attempted. Terrified because Columbo was, at its heart, a comfort watch. Audiences tuned in on a Sunday night not to be unsettled by a killer's philosophy, but to enjoy the ritual of watching an unassuming little man calmly dismantle an arrogant person's ego. A villain with no motive at all threatened to break that ritual. If the audience couldn't understand why someone killed, could they still enjoy watching him get caught? The producers weren't sure, and television in the early 1970s did not reward that kind of uncertainty. There was also, by several accounts, a practical problem layered on top of the creative one. That same year, a major writer's strike had thrown the production schedule into chaos, and the show was scrambling to fill its lineup. A competing spec script had come in around the same time, one with a more straightforward premise and a villain who used technical trickery, subliminal imagery, rather than philosophy, to commit his crime. It was, crucially, much easier and cheaper to shoot on the compressed timeline the strike had forced on everyone. Faced with a choice between an ambitious, unconventional script that would need more time, more resources, and more creative risk, and a serviceable one that could be turned around quickly, the producers reportedly went with the safer option. That doesn't mean the more daring script vanished without a trace. Elements of it, according to people who worked on the show, quietly resurfaced in later episodes. A plot device here, a visual idea there, most notably a storyline involving film students trailing Columbo with a camera, echoing the original pitch's obsession with surveillance and performance. But the script itself, the one that dared to give Columbo a killer motivated by nothing but ego and art, was shelved. Not officially banned. Not the subject of a dramatic burning in effigy. Just quietly set aside, the way so many ambitious ideas in television are, deemed too expensive, too strange, too much of a departure from a formula that was working just fine without it. 50 years is a long time for a story like that to sit in a drawer, and it's worth asking why nobody dug it back out sooner. Part of the answer is that Columbo, unlike a lot of shows from its era, never really left the cultural conversation long enough for anyone to go looking. It aired in dozens of countries. It got revival seasons well into the 1990s. Peter Falk kept returning to the role, on and off, for over 3 decades, right up until his final performance in the early 2000s. There was rarely a moment where fans were desperate enough for lost content that a rumored, never-filmed spec script from the 1970s seemed worth chasing down. It's also worth saying plainly, the idea of this being hidden or too dark for television makes for a great hook, but the more mundane truth is probably closer to ordinary studio politics, a scheduling crunch, a network nervous about tone, a competing script that was simply easier to produce on deadline. That's a less thrilling explanation than a cover-up, but it's the one that fits how television actually gets made. Shows don't usually bury scripts because they're dangerous. They set them aside because they're expensive, or risky, or don't fit the formula that's currently making money. The far more interesting question isn't why the network said no. It's why a filmmaker who openly disliked television bothered to write for Columbo in the first place, and what that says about how good the show actually was. Because that's really the heart of this story. A director with a reputation for looking down on the medium sat down, on his own time, and tried to write an episode of a network detective show. Not because he was hired to. Not because it paid well. Because something about a scruffy little man in a raincoat, quietly humiliating people who thought they were untouchable, had gotten under his skin. That's not the kind of reaction you get from disposable television. That's the reaction you get from a show that had figured out something true about human nature and packaged it inside 45 minutes of Sunday night entertainment. Peter Falk, for his part, never seemed particularly interested in mythologizing the show. By most accounts from people who worked with him, he treated every script, ambitious or ordinary, with the same stubborn perfectionism. He was famous on set for slowing productions down, reworking scenes on the spot, showing up with his own ideas about how a line should land or how long a pause should sit before Columbo turned back around in a doorway to ask one more question. Directors who came in expecting a quick, professional shoot sometimes left exhausted, having learned that Falk considered the character partly his own creation and was not shy about defending it. That instinct, protectiveness bordering on obsession, might be exactly why an unconventional, motiveless killer script made some people nervous. Falk had spent years building a very specific relationship with his audience. Humble little man, impossible odds, quiet triumph of decency over arrogance. A story about a killer who murders purely to prove a philosophical point doesn't fit neatly into that relationship. It doesn't offer the same catharsis. You can't feel quite as satisfied watching Columbo win when the person he's beating doesn't even care about winning or losing in any way the audience recognizes. And yet, watching the show's legacy unfold over the decades since, it's hard not to wonder what audiences might have made of that stranger, colder version of the character if it had ever reached the screen. Columbo has always had an uneasy relationship with prestige. It was never quite treated as serious art in its own era, dismissed by some critics as comfortable, formulaic Sunday night television, even as it quietly did something genuinely sophisticated with structure and class commentary. Every killer on that show, without exception, believed themselves smarter, richer, or more important than the law. Every episode ended with quiet proof that they were wrong. That's a deceptively simple formula, but it's also a pointed one, repeated across 100 episodes with real teeth underneath the polite dialogue and the shabby raincoat. A version of the show willing to strip out even the killer's motive, to make the crime itself a kind of performance rather than a means to an end, would have pushed that class commentary somewhere darker and stranger. It would have suggested that the ultimate act of arrogance isn't killing for money or revenge, things regular people can at least understand, but killing simply because you can, because you're bored, because you want to see if you're clever enough to get away with nothing at all. That's a chilling idea for a network detective show to sit with. It's also, frankly, a very modern one, arriving decades before true crime documentaries and media obsession with performative violence became a cultural fixation of their own. Maybe that's the real reason the script never got made, not because it was too dark exactly, but because it was early. Too early for a television landscape that wasn't ready to ask its audience to sit with a villain who offered no comfortable explanation at all. Columbo was, at its core, a reassuring show. It told viewers, week after week, that the world made sense, that arrogance eventually meets its match, that a patient, unassuming person with sharp eyes could always find a thread and pull it. A story about a killer who defies that comfort, who can't be explained away, who commits violence as abstract art rather than practical crime, threatens the entire emotional contract the show had built with millions of viewers. It's tempting, looking back from decades later, to treat this as some grand conspiracy, a script locked away because network executives were afraid of what it might unleash. The truth is almost certainly smaller and more human than that. A strike-shortened production schedule, a nervous set of producers protecting a winning formula, a script that was simply too ambitious for the resources and appetite available at the time. But small, human reasons don't make for a less interesting story. If anything, they make it more interesting, because they tell us something real about how television gets made, how even the most successful, beloved shows are shaped as much by deadlines and budgets as by artistic vision, and how the boldest ideas often lose not to censorship but to scheduling. What we're left with, 50 years later, is a kind of ghost episode, a story that exists mostly in second-hand accounts, in fragments that supposedly leaked into later scripts, in the memory of people who once read a pitch that never got filmed. We'll probably never see it exactly as it was written. The strike ended, the show moved on, other scripts got produced, and the world kept watching Peter Falk squint at wine glasses and ask one more question until, decades later, illness finally took the role away from him entirely. But the fact that this story persists at all says something about how much people still care about that rumpled detective and the strange, quiet power of the show built around him. A pitch that was never filmed shouldn't still be worth talking about 50 years on. And yet here we are, picking it apart, wondering what might have been. That, in its own way, is the most Columbo ending imaginable. Not a dramatic reveal, not a locked vault bursting open, just a small, persistent question that refuses to go away, circling back again and again to ask one more thing.